Aster Rowan was dragged into the basement hall of the Drakov Syndicate with blood drying at the corner of his mouth and a steel collar locked around his throat. His wrists were bound behind his back, his knees were bruised from the van floor, and his torn black shirt hung loose from one shoulder. But he kept walking because falling would only give the watching alphas exactly what they wanted. The hall was packed with captains, enforcers, debt collectors, gunmen, and men who had killed enough people to stop reacting to fear. They stood in silence beneath the cold lights, forming a wide circle around the execution floor. Nobody spoke loudly here. Nobody needed to. In the Drakov Syndicate, silence was usually the last warning before someone disappeared. At the far end of the hall stood Vaxen Drakov. He was 32 Alpha, head of the most dangerous Mafia syndicate in the city, and the kind of man people obeyed before he gave the order. He wore a black coat over a dark shirt, no jewelry except the silver signet ring of the Drakov family, and his face showed nothing as Aster was shoved to his knees in front of him. To everyone in that room, the case was already closed. Aster Rowan was a rogue Omega. He had no pack, no registered guardian, no legal protection inside the underground world, and no family powerful enough to demand answers. 3 months ago, he had been found beside the body of Dorian Drakov, Vaxen's adopted younger brother and the Syndicate's golden heir. Dorian had been stabbed through the ribs with his own knife, and Aster had disappeared before anyone could question him. That was enough for the Syndicate. A rogue Omega had killed a Drakov Alpha. The price was death. Naira Solis, Vaxen's beta captain and head of security, stood near the west wall with 2 armed guards behind her. She was sharp-eyed, short-haired, and still enough to look carved from stone. Aster noticed her because she was the only person in the room not looking at him with hunger, hatred, or disgust. She watched him like she was measuring a problem. One of the older captains stepped forward and read the charge from a tablet. Aster Rowan, rogue Omega, unregistered, accused of murdering Dorian Drakov, heir of the Drakov Syndicate, captured after 92 days of pursuit. Sentence approved by the Family Council. Execution to be carried out by the head of the Syndicate. A low murmur moved through the room. Aster stared at the concrete floor and said nothing. He had learned years ago that the truth did not matter unless someone powerful wanted to hear it. He had also learned that begging only made predators lean closer. So he kept his back straight, swallowed the blood in his mouth, and forced himself not to look at Vaxen's gun. Vaxen finally moved. He stepped down from the raised platform with calm, controlled steps. Every man in the hall went still. Even the captains stopped shifting. That was the effect Vaxen had. He did not need to raise his voice, because fear did the work for him. He stopped 2 steps from Aster. "Look at me," Vaxen said. Aster lifted his head. The first thing he saw was not cruelty. That almost made it worse. Cruelty was simple. Cruelty had teeth, hands, a smell, a pattern. Vaxen's face held only cold judgment, and cold judgment was harder to fight because it believed itself clean. "You ran for 3 months," Vaxen said. "You crossed 5 territories, killed 2 men sent to bring you in, and still carried my brother's blood on your hands." "They weren't bringing me in," Aster said, his voice rough but steady. "They were taking me back." Several men laughed. Vaxen did not. "Back where?" he asked. Aster's jaw tightened. He almost answered. The words rose in his throat, sharp and bitter. But he saw Dorian's face in his mind and heard that same smooth voice again. "No one will believe you. Not after what you are. Not after what I made you look like." So Aster said nothing. The older captain scoffed. "He is stalling." Another alpha near the front added, "End it. Dorian deserves blood." Vaxen did not look away from Aster. "Last chance." Aster held his gaze. "If you want the truth, you will have to do more than point a gun at me." The room reacted instantly. Growls rose from every side. One guard grabbed Aster by the hair and yanked his head back, but Aster bit the inside of his cheek and refused to cry out. Vaxen raised one hand. The room went quiet again. "Remove the collar," he ordered. The guard hesitated. "Boss, remove it." The lock clicked open, and the steel collar dropped from Aster's throat. He inhaled too sharply before he could stop himself. The air entered his lungs like pain, and the scent he had been holding back slipped into the room for half a second. Omega. Faint, damaged, medicated, buried under cheap suppressants and exhaustion, but still there. Several alphas reacted at once. Their eyes sharpened. Their breathing changed. Aster felt it and hated how his body recognized danger before his mind could name it. Vaxen noticed everything. His expression hardened, but not at Aster. "Enough," he said. The men stepped back. Vaxen turned slightly toward Naira. "Cut his restraints." Naira crossed the room herself. She drew a blade, sliced the plastic ties from Aster's wrists, and leaned close enough for only him to hear. "Do not run," she said. "Not because I care, but because they are waiting for you to try." Aster flexed his numb fingers and did not answer. Vaxen lifted his gun. The room leaned into the moment. Then one of the guards behind Aster grabbed the back of his shirt and pulled him upright for the final shot. The fabric, already torn from the capture, ripped completely down the spine. The hall changed. It was not loud. It was the opposite. The silence cut off every breath in the room. Cold air hit Aster's back, and he knew exactly what they were seeing. 36 scars. Straight, precise, pale against his skin, arranged in parallel lines from his shoulders to his lower back. Some were old and silver. Some were darker. Some had healed badly because he had been running when they split open again. They were too neat to be from beatings and too deliberate to be from street violence. They looked like surgery because that was what they were. The laughter died. Even the men who had wanted his blood stopped moving. Vaxen's gun lowered by an inch. Aster closed his eyes, not because he was ashamed, but because he was tired of being looked at like evidence. Naira was the first to speak, and her voice had lost its usual flatness. "Boss." Vaxen did not answer her. He stepped closer, slow now, as if one wrong movement might change what he was seeing. His eyes moved across the scars with a precision that made Aster's stomach twist. Not confusion. Recognition. That was worse. Vaxen knew something. "Where did you get these?" he asked. Aster opened his eyes. "You already know enough to ask that question." One of the captains swallowed. "Could be prison surgery. Could be gang punishment." "No," Vaxen said. That one word killed the excuse before it could spread. He came around Aster and stopped where they could see each other again. His face was still controlled, but something dangerous had shifted underneath it. The cold judgment was gone. In its place was calculation, anger, and a memory he clearly did not want to have. "Who cut you?" Vaxen asked. Aster looked at the gun in his hand. "Does it matter before you kill me?" "It matters now." Aster almost laughed, but there was no humor in him. "It did not matter when I was 16. It did not matter when I escaped. It did not matter when your brother found me again." Vaxen's eyes sharpened. "Dorian." At the name, Aster's entire body went still. That was enough. Vaxen saw it. So did Naira. The older captain stepped forward quickly. "Boss, this changes nothing. He murdered Dorian. Whatever happened to him before does not erase that." Aster looked at the man and finally spoke with enough force to make the closest guards tense. "I killed Dorian because he was dragging me back to the place that made those scars." The words hit harder than a scream. Nobody moved. Vaxen stared at him for several seconds. "Back to what place?" Aster's throat tightened. He could still smell disinfectant. Metal tables. Burning chemicals. Omega fear trapped behind locked doors. He could still feel latex gloves on his skin and hear doctors discussing his body like it was inventory. "A laboratory," he said. "Underground. Private. Expensive. Built for alphas who wanted to buy omegas with perfect pheromones." The room erupted. Captains shouted over each other. Someone called him a liar. Someone else cursed. One alpha demanded the execution continue before this became an insult to Dorian's memory. Vaxen fired one shot into the ceiling. The sound cracked through the hall and silenced everyone. Aster did not flinch. That seemed to disturb Vaxen more than if he had. Vaxen turned to Naira. "Clear the room." The older captain stepped forward again. "You cannot be serious." Vaxen looked at him once. "I said clear the room." No one argued after that. Naira moved fast, giving orders with sharp gestures. Guards pushed captains toward the exits. Enforcers muttered, but they left. Within minutes, the hall emptied until only Vaxen, Naira, for trusted guards, and Aster remained. Aster stayed on his knees because his legs had started shaking, and he would rather kneel by choice than fall by weakness. Vaxen crouched in front of him, close enough that Aster could feel the weight of his alpha presence but not close enough to touch. That distance mattered. Aster noticed it despite himself. "You said Dorian was taking you back," Vaxen said. Was he connected to the lab? Aster stared at him. Connected. His voice turned bitter. Your brother delivered omegas to them like shipments. He laughed when they paid him. He told me an omega only had value when an alpha was willing to buy him. Naira's face tightened. Vaxen went very still. Aster saw grief strike him, but it did not look soft. It looked like something sharp had entered his chest and stayed there. For one moment he was not the Mafia boss, not the executioner, not the alpha every man feared. He was an older brother hearing something he could not afford to believe and could not afford to ignore. Then the mask returned. Take him upstairs, Vaxen said. Naira frowned slightly. The holding cells? No, Vaxen said. My penthouse. Private floor. Double security. No one touches him without my order. Aster looked at him sharply. So I am still a prisoner. Vaxen met his eyes. Yes. Then nothing changed. Everything changed, Vaxen said. You are alive. Aster hated that he had no answer for that. They brought him upstairs through private elevators and silent corridors. The penthouse was larger than any safe house Aster had ever hidden in. All dark glass, locked doors, expensive furniture, and controlled exits. It was not freedom, but it was not a basement, and that difference unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Naira placed him in a guest room with a bathroom, clean clothes, bottled water, and no visible cameras. She paused at the door. There are guards outside. The windows do not open. If you try to escape, you will fail. Aster sat on the edge of the bed. You always this comforting? Only with murder suspects who make my boss question his dead brother. Then she left. Aster did not sleep. He showered until the water ran cold, changed into the plain gray shirt left for him, and sat with his back against the wall where no one could come behind him. The bed was too soft. The room was too quiet. His body did not understand safety, especially when it came from an alpha who had nearly executed him an hour earlier. Sometime after midnight, his breathing broke. The room disappeared. For a few seconds he was back under white lights, wrists strapped down, doctors above him, Dorian watching through glass with that clean, perfect smile. Aster slammed one hand over his mouth before the sound could escape. A knock came at the door. He froze. Vaxen's voice came from the other side. I am not coming in. Aster said nothing. A pause. Then Vaxen spoke again, lower this time. But I am staying here until morning. Aster stared at the door. He should have hated it. He should have told him to leave. He should have said that sitting outside a door did not erase a gun pointed at his head or a dead brother's name between them. Instead, he stayed silent. Hours passed. Vaxen did not enter. He did not ask questions. He did not use his alpha command. He simply remained outside the door, a dangerous man choosing restraint when every instinct in him probably demanded answers. Near dawn, Aster finally leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. He did not trust Vaxen Drakov. Not yet. But for one night, the alpha who had meant to kill him became the only thing standing between him and the nightmare waiting in the dark. By morning, Vaxen Drakov had not moved from the hallway outside Aster Rowan's door, and that single fact became more dangerous to Aster than any threat made in the execution hall. Threats were simple because they demanded resistance, but restraint demanded questions, and questions were the last thing Aster wanted to give any alpha room to grow inside his head. Naira Solis entered at 7 with coffee, clean bandages, and a tablet already filled with security reports. She found Vaxen standing near the window at the end of the corridor, still in yesterday's clothes, his gun tucked away, his expression cold enough to keep every guard 2 steps farther than necessary. She did not ask why he had stayed there all night. Naira was too disciplined for useless questions, and she knew Vaxen well enough to understand that silence from him usually meant something had already changed. He did not sleep, she said. Neither did I, Vaxen answered. That was not what I meant. Vaxen looked toward the closed door. Bring me everything Dorian touched in the last 4 years. Accounts, shell companies, medical transfers, offshore holdings, private clinics, shipping routes, and every Omega disappearance report that was buried before it reached police. Naira's eyes sharpened. You believe him. I believe the scars. That answer will start a war. Then prepare for one quietly. Inside the room, Aster heard enough to understand that Vaxen was not pretending anymore. He sat on the edge of the bed with both hands wrapped around a bottle of water he had not opened, his back carefully angled away from the door, his body still acting like an escape was possible even when his mind knew the penthouse had been designed to prevent exactly that. He hated that the guards had given him clean clothes. He hated that the bathroom mirror had good lighting. He hated most of all that when he looked at his own face, he could still recognize the boy who had once believed medical school would be his whole future. Vaxen entered only after knocking twice and waiting for permission that Aster did not give. Even then, he stopped near the door instead of crossing the room. The distance was deliberate, and Aster noticed it because men with power usually came close simply to prove they could. "I need names," Vaxen said. "You need proof," Aster corrected. "I need both." Aster looked at him for a long moment. "If I give you names, your captains will say I am buying time. If I give you proof, your family will say I forged it. If I show you bodies, they will say Omegas lie when they want pity." Vaxen's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. "Then tell me where to start." That question was not mercy, and Aster knew better than to confuse it with trust. Still, it was useful, and useful things had kept him alive. He told Vaxen about a clinic registered under a fake charity, a shipping company that moved medical equipment at night, and an abandoned pharmaceutical warehouse outside the industrial district where the laboratory had once moved him through a service elevator with a black bag over his head. He told him about white corridors, coded doors, doctors without names, and alpha investors who watched from behind glass while Omegas were injected, measured, sedated, and priced. He did not tell him everything. Not yet. Some memories still had teeth. Vaxen listened without interrupting, and that made Aster angrier than if he had doubted him. Doubt was expected. Listening felt like pressure against an old wound. When Aster finally stopped speaking, Vaxen did not offer comfort, and for that one choice, Aster hated him a little less. "I will verify this," Vaxen said. "You will try." "I will verify it." Aster looked away. Dorian said that too once. He said he would verify who had bought me before he decided whether I was worth keeping. Vaxen went still. The name sat between them like a loaded weapon. "My brother was many things," Vaxen said, and the words came out harder than grief. "But if what you say is true, then he was not the man I buried." "He was exactly the man you buried," Aster replied. "You just did not know which part of him was real." For 3 days, the penthouse became a locked room filled with evidence. Naira came and went with encrypted drives, bank statements, security footage, and photographs taken from places that officially did not exist. A thin, nervous accountant named Ivo Merrick was brought in under armed escort because he had managed Dorian's hidden money for years, and within 20 minutes of Vaxen's silence, he began talking faster than his fear could keep up. Ivo explained shell companies, research payments, offshore medical grants, and a private biotech network called Helix Crown, which had no public investors but received millions from accounts tied to old Mafia families. Aster heard the name Helix Crown from the kitchen doorway and dropped the mug in his hand. It shattered across the floor. Every guard turned. Vaxen moved before anyone else could. He crossed the room, not to grab Aster, but to stand between him and the men staring too hard. "Out!" he ordered. Naira cleared the guards instantly. Aster stayed frozen, his breathing uneven, his eyes fixed on the broken ceramic as if it had opened a door under his feet. Vaxen saw the tremor in his hands and reached toward him, then stopped before touching. That restraint again. That impossible, infuriating restraint. "Helix Crown," Vaxen said carefully. "That is the lab?" Aster swallowed once. "That is what they called the program." "What program?" Aster looked at him then, and the anger in his eyes was cleaner than fear. "The perfect Omega program." He told them more that evening because the name had already dragged the truth into the open. Helix Crown was not trying to heal Omegas or treat damaged pheromone glands, no matter what its stolen medical files claimed. It was building a product for rich alphas who wanted guaranteed compatibility, controlled heat cycles, enhanced fertility, addictive scent response, and Omegas who would bond on command. The scars on Aster's back were not random operations. Each one marked another attempt to rewrite how his body responded to alpha pheromones. Vaxen's face stayed calm, but his hand closed so tightly around the edge of the table that the wood cracked. Aster saw it and said, "Do not perform rage for me. I am not performing. Then do something useful with it." That was when he gave Vaxen the first real piece of proof he had kept hidden for 3 months. Inside the hem of the jacket he had been wearing when captured, beneath a loose thread no guard had thought to check, Aster had sewn a microdrive. Naira cut it free and plugged it into an isolated laptop while Aster stood behind her, arms crossed tightly, Every part of him braced for betrayal. The files opened. Patient lists. Payment records. Videos. Names. Dorian Drakov appeared in one of the recordings, smiling behind observation glass while a sedated Omega convulsed on a steel bed. His voice came through the speaker clearly, almost bored, as he told the doctors to increase the dose because the buyer wanted visible results before the auction. Nobody spoke. Vaxon watched his brother's face on the screen until the video ended. And when it did, something inside him seemed to close forever. Not grief. Not denial. Something colder and more final. Naira shut the laptop. There is enough here to execute half the underworld, she said. Not half, Vaxon replied. The people who funded it. By midnight, the names behind Helix Crown had been traced to a private council known as the 12 Founders, the old alphas who had financed the Drakov Syndicate before Vaxon inherited it. They were not figureheads, as Vaxon had believed. They were owners, silent and patient, with money inside banks, ports, clinics, courts, and police units. At the center was Magnus Varelli, a 67-year-old alpha businessman who publicly donated to hospitals and privately owned the company that supplied Helix Crown with surgical equipment. Astor stared at Magnus' photo on the screen. His stomach turned. Vaxon noticed. You know him. Astor's voice went flat. He bought viewing rights. Naira's expression hardened. Viewing rights. They let investors watch trials before auctions, Astor said. Magnus liked to choose which Omegas were worth keeping alive. That was the moment Vaxon stopped treating the investigation like a family scandal and began treating it like an enemy operation. He froze accounts, moved loyal crews, locked down communication channels, and ordered Naira to identify every captain whose money touched founder accounts. But the founders were already moving. 2 safe houses stopped answering. 3 captains refused direct orders. 1 warehouse burned before Vaxon's men could reach the records inside. The war had begun before anyone announced it. During those days, Astor and Vaxon were forced into each other's orbit by danger, evidence, and something neither of them wanted to name. Astor cooked one evening because standing still made him feel useless, and Vaxon entered the kitchen to find him making soup with the controlled focus of someone trying not to break apart. He did not comment. He simply took a bowl when Astor pushed it toward him and ate in silence at the counter. As if the most wanted Omega in the city feeding the Mafia boss who had nearly killed him was not strange enough to stop the world. Later that night, Astor's heat spiked. It came without warning, triggered by stress, exhaustion, and the lingering damage Helix Crown had left inside his body. His scent filled the room too fast, sweet and wounded, and every guard on the floor reacted before Naira could drag them out. Vaxon was already there, his alpha instincts visibly fighting his control, but he did not step closer until Astor forced the word out. Suppressants. Vaxon brought them himself. His hand shook once when he passed the injector over, but he turned his face away, giving Astor privacy instead of watching him fall apart. Astor pressed the suppressant into his thigh, breathing hard, waiting for the fever to ease. When it finally did, he looked up and found Vaxon standing with his back to him, shoulders tense, every line of his body held back by will. You could have used that, Astor said. Vaxon did not turn around. I know. Most alphas would. I am not most alphas. Astor wanted to reject that sentence because it sounded too close to hope, and hope was dangerous when it came from a man who still owned the building around him. Instead, he said nothing, and that silence became another thing between them, warmer than trust and not yet safe enough to call anything else. The next morning, Magnus Varelli answered Vaxon's war with a message sent to every Drakov captain. Vaxon played it once in the main office while Naira, Evo, and Astor listened. Magnus' voice was smooth, rich, and almost amused. Vaxon Drakov has allowed a damaged rogue Omega to poison his judgment. Dorian's murderer has compromised him, and any captain loyal to the syndicate must remove the infected head before the body dies with him. Kill the Alpha if necessary. Bring the Omega back alive. Astor felt the room narrow around him. Vaxon turned off the recording. No one spoke. That was when Astor finally understood the shape of the danger. Vaxon was not only risking money, reputation, or revenge. He was risking the entire empire he had spent his life controlling, and he was doing it for proof, for buried victims, and for an Omega everyone else had already decided was disposable. That realization hurt more than it comforted. Because if Vaxon kept going, he might die. Because if Vaxon died, Astor would be the reason. That night, after the penthouse went quiet, Aster took the second microdrive from beneath a loosened tile in the bathroom, the one he had never told anyone about. It contained the lab's location, access codes, and the list of Omegas still alive inside Helix Crown. He copied everything to Vaxen's secure system, left the original on his desk, and wrote one note by hand because typed words felt too easy for a goodbye. Don't destroy your life trying to save someone who was never allowed to have one. Then Aster walked out through the emergency service passage he had found on the second day, surrendered himself to the founder soldiers waiting below, and did not fight when they locked a black collar around his throat. By sunrise, Vaxen found the note. Naira found the security breach. And across the city, Magnus Varelli received the Omega he had ordered brought back alive. Vaxen stood in the wrecked silence of his office, holding Aster's note in one hand and the microdrive in the other, while every remaining loyal guard waited for orders. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm enough to frighten even Naira. Call every crew still loyal to me. Naira looked at him. And tell them what? Vaxen folded Aster's note once, carefully, as if it were something precious and breakable. Tell them the Drakov Syndicate is going to war. By the time the sun rose over the city, the Drakov Syndicate had already split in half. Vaxen Drakov stood in the center of his command room with Aster's note folded inside his coat and the stolen Helix Crown microdrive locked in Naira Solis's tactical case. Around him, loyal crews loaded weapons, burned compromised phones, and erased safe house locations before the founder-backed captains could sell them out. No one asked whether this was still a rescue mission or a declaration of war, because Vaxen's face already gave them the answer. Naira placed a city map on the table and marked 3 locations in red. Magnus has men at the river depot, the old medical warehouse, and a private airstrip outside the city. If he wants to move Aster quietly, he will use one of those routes before nightfall. He will not move him yet, Vaxen said. Magnus ordered him alive because Helix Crown still needs him. Naira looked up. You sound certain. Vaxen's jaw tightened. Aster said he was the one they kept trying to perfect. Men like Magnus do not return expensive property without using it. The word property cut through the room harder than a threat. Vaxen saw several guards look away, and he let them feel the shame of it for 1 second before he gave the order. Hit the depot and warehouse at the same time. Do not take prisoners unless they have access codes. I want Helix Crown's location before Magnus finishes whatever he started. Across the city, Aster Rowan woke strapped to a medical chair with a black collar around his throat and an M4 already in his arm. White lights burned above him. The room smelled of disinfectant, metal, and old fear. His body recognized the place before his eyes fully opened, and for a moment he was 16 again, trapped under bright lights while doctors discussed his value like he was not inside the body they were cutting open. Then Magnus Varelli stepped into view. He wore a dark gray suit, silver hair combed back, expression calm and pleased, like a collector admiring a rare object returned with only minor damage. Behind him stood Dr. Celine Armand, Helix Crown's lead scientist, a thin beta woman with pale eyes and hands that never shook, no matter how many Omegas screamed under them. You caused trouble, Magnus said. Aster swallowed against the collar. You sent enough men to make me feel missed. Magnus smiled. I always admired your mouth. It made the investors angry, but it proved your mind stayed intact longer than the others. Aster pulled once against the restraints. They did not move. If you wanted me scared, you should have brought someone new. Dr. Armand checked the 4-line without looking at his face. Subject A09 remains verbally resistant, but pheromone response is unstable. Stress has accelerated compatibility activity. Aster went cold. Magnus noticed and leaned closer. You understand now, don't you? You were never another failed Omega. You were the closest thing we ever made to a universal mate. With one final adjustment, any alpha with enough money could bond with someone like you, whether fate chose them or not. Aster's stomach turned, but his mind stayed sharp. He had not surrendered only to die in a chair. Before leaving Vaxen's penthouse, he had memorized the old access codes from the microdrive, and during the ride here he had counted turns, elevator drops, and the hum of ventilation systems. Helix Crown had moved deeper underground, but laboratories still had habits, and Aster knew those habits better than any guard in the building. While Magnus spoke, Aster twisted his left thumb until the joint slipped far enough to loosen the restraint. Pain flashed up his arm, but pain was familiar and therefore useful. He waited until Dr. Armand turned to prepare the serum, then pulled free just enough to reach the emergency release under the chair. The alarm did not sound immediately. That meant the system was still old. That meant he had seconds. He grabbed a scalpel from the tray, cut the 4-line, and drove the blade into the nearest guard's thigh when the man lunged for him. The guard dropped with a shout. Aster rolled hard, hit the floor, and slammed his shoulder into the red release panel on the wall. Every holding room on that corridor unlocked at once. The laboratory erupted. Doors opened. Omegas stumbled into the hall, some drugged, some bleeding, some too terrified to move until Aster shouted at them to run toward the service stairs. A young Omega named Tavin, barely 20 and shaking under an oversized hospital gown, grabbed Aster's arm and asked where to go. Aster shoved the scalpel into his hand and pointed left. Follow the red pipes. They lead to maintenance. Do not stop for anyone. Tavin ran. Aster did not. He found the server room by memory and instinct, because every Helix Crown facility kept its research close to the operating wing. He smashed the cooling panel, ripped out the backup drives, and triggered the chemical fire suppression system before the guards caught up. The servers began to overload, sparks bursting behind the glass cabinets. Years of stolen bodies, auction files, dosage formulas, and artificial mate protocols burned in seconds. Then Magnus' men reached him. They beat him down in the corridor, fast and professional, careful not to kill him because Magnus had given clear orders. By the time they dragged him back to the procedure room, his lip was split, one eye was swelling, and his broken thumb throbbed so badly he could barely think. But he heard sirens above. Gunfire followed. Deep, heavy, organized. Vaxen had found him. Magnus heard it too. His calm expression finally cracked. Start the final injection. Dr. Armand hesitated. Without full stabilization, the subject may die. Then make him useful before he does. The serum entered Aster's blood like fire. His body arched against the restraints. Heat slammed through him, not natural heat, not the broken spikes he had survived before, but something violent and engineered. His pheromones exploded outward, too sweet, too strong, wrong in a way that made every alpha in the room stagger. Guards cursed and backed away. One dropped his weapon. Another reached toward Aster with glassy eyes before Naira shot him through the doorway. The rescue hit like a storm. Naira entered first with a rifle raised, 2 loyal Drakov enforcers behind her. Vaxen followed through smoke and gunfire, his coat torn, blood on his cheek, his alpha scent cutting through the poisoned air like a blade. The moment Aster saw him, something inside his chest reached toward him despite the pain. Vaxen, he forced out. Vaxen crossed the room, killing one guard at close range before throwing another into the operating table. Magnus tried to retreat, but Naira blocked the exit and drove her gun into his chest. Dr. Armand shouted over the alarms. Do not touch him. The serum is rewriting his pheromone response. If it continues, his organs will fail within minutes. Vaxen ripped the restraints from Aster's wrists. How do I stop it? Dr. Armand looked at Aster, then at Vaxen, and her face showed fear for the first time. A true mate bond. If it exists, nothing artificial can override one. The room seemed to narrow around them. Aster shook his head weakly because he understood what that meant. A mark was not a bandage. It was not a temporary rescue. It would tie them together in blood, scent, instinct, and future. And every Mafia leader who survived this night would know exactly what Vaxen had chosen. Don't, Aster whispered. Not because of them. Vaxen lowered himself beside him, one hand carefully cupping the back of Aster's neck, avoiding the scars, avoiding every place men had hurt him before. His voice was rough, but steady. Not because of them. Not because of the serum. Not because I own you. Aster's breathing broke. Vaxen held his gaze. Because you choose me and I choose you. Tell me no, and I stop. Even with the heat tearing through him, Aster heard the difference. No command. No claim. No purchase. Only a choice placed in his hands when his whole life had been built by people taking choices away. He reached up with his uninjured hand and gripped Vaxen's shirt. Then do it. Vaxen bent and bit deep into the side of Aster's neck. The mark hit like thunder. Aster cried out, not from pain alone, but from the sudden, violent collapse of everything false inside him. The artificial pheromones shattered against the bond. The poison heat broke apart. His body stopped fighting itself. For one impossible second, Every scar on his back seemed to burn with remembered pain. And then the pain loosened, not gone, but no longer alone. Vaxen held him through it. Around them, the laboratory burned. Naira arrested Magnus at gunpoint while surviving Omegas were rushed out through the service tunnels. Dr. Armand tried to run and was taken down by Tavin, who still held the scalpel Aster had given him. When Vaxen lifted Aster into his arms, the Alpha's eyes were black with rage, grief, and something far more dangerous than either. Aster rested his head against Vaxen's shoulder, too exhausted to pretend he did not need the warmth. "Your empire," he murmured. Vaxen carried him through smoke, gunfire, and falling glass without looking back. "Let it burn," he said. "I found what matters." Aster Rowan woke 3 days after the laboratory burned with a bandage on his neck, a dull ache in his bones, and Vaxen Drakov asleep in a chair beside his hospital bed. The room was inside a private medical wing owned by the Syndicate, guarded by Naira Solis and sealed from every captain who had not proven loyalty before the war ended. Machines monitored Aster's heartbeat, his pheromone levels, and the slow recovery of a body that had been forced to survive too much for too long. Vaxen looked terrible. There was a stitched cut across his cheek, bruising around one eye, dried blood at the edge of his sleeve, and a handgun resting on the table within reach even while he slept. Aster watched him for several minutes and understood something quiet and dangerous. The mark had saved his life. It had not made him less afraid of needing someone. That was the harder thing. When Aster shifted, Vaxen woke instantly, one hand going to the gun before his eyes focused on the bed. The moment he saw Aster awake, the violence left his face so fast it almost hurt to see. "Aster," he said. Aster swallowed. His throat felt raw. "Did we win?" Vaxen leaned forward, careful not to touch him without permission. "The lab is gone. Magnus is alive and locked under Naira's guard. Dr. Armand is in custody. 42 Omegas were taken out of Helix Crown. The servers you burned destroyed most of their active research, and the microdrive you left gave us enough evidence to expose the founders." Aster closed his eyes for a second. 42 was not everyone, but it was not nothing. It was 42 people who had walked out alive because he had gone back in and because Vaxen had come after him. "And the Syndicate?" he asked. "Broken," Vaxen said honestly. "Not destroyed. Not yet rebuilt. Several captains fled. 2 surrendered. 4 are dead. The founder accounts are frozen. And every organization tied to Helix Crown is pretending they never heard the name." Aster opened his eyes. "So the Empire burned." Vaxen held his gaze. "Good." The answer should have been too simple, but Aster was too tired to argue with it. His hand moved toward his neck before he thought better of it, finger stopping just below the bandage covering the mark. Vaxen noticed, and something guarded entered his expression. "If you regret it," Vaxen said, voice controlled but lower than before, "say it. I will not punish you for hating what saved you." Aster looked at him for a long moment. "I do not hate the mark." Vaxen said nothing. "I hate that they forced us into a room where it had to happen," Aster continued. "I hate that my body was almost turned into something they could sell. I hate that I was dying and you had to choose fast. But I remember what you said before you did it." Vaxen's jaw tightened slightly. "That it was your choice." "Yes." Aster's voice softened. "That part matters. The recovery did not become easy because the villains were caught or because the mark was real." Aster still woke from nightmares with his hands clawing at invisible restraints. Some mornings he could not stand anyone behind him. Some nights the scent of antiseptic made him sick before he reached the bathroom. His back healed, but the scars remained, straight and pale, mapping every year Helix Crown had stolen from him. Vaxen did not try to erase them. He did not call them beautiful in that careless way people used when they wanted pain to become easier to look at. He simply learned the rules of Aster's body. He approached from the front. He asked before touching. When Aster could not sleep, Vaxen sat on the floor beside the bed instead of climbing in uninvited. When the mark burned during unstable pheromone spikes, he offered his wrist, his scent, or distance depending on what Aster chose. That patience did more damage to Aster's walls than force ever could. 2 weeks after the raid, Naira brought the first full report. She placed it on the table in Vaxen's office while Aster sat near the window with a blanket over his shoulders and a cup of coffee he had barely touched. 42 rescued from the main site, Naira said. 12 more identified through transport records. 5 safe houses confirmed. Helix Crown was not one laboratory. It was a network. Aster's hand tightened around the cup. Vaxen noticed, but he let Naira continue. There is another name in the records, she said. Kasrenko? Beta? 28. Former emergency nurse. Trafficked 2 years ago, and later used as medical staff after they threatened his younger brother. He helped move sedatives and patient files. He also smuggled food to captives and marked emergency exits on old maintenance maps. Without his notes, half the rescued Omegas would not have found the tunnels. Aster looked up. Where is he? Under protection. He wants to testify. Vaxen turned to Aster. Your call. Aster stared at him. Mine. You know what they need better than I do. The sentence landed with more weight than praise. It gave him authority without asking him to perform strength. Aster set the cup down and reached for the report. That was how the Aegis network began, not with a ceremony or a speech, but with a list of names and the decision not to let them become buried files. Vaxen offered money, safe houses, armed transport, legal pressure, and every intelligence contact the Drakov syndicate still controlled. Naira built security protocols and personally trained the rescue teams. Kasrenko became the network's first medical coordinator, handling survivors who trusted a former captive more than any clean doctor in a white coat. Aster became the one they asked before making choices that affected Omegas. He refused the title Vaxen's remaining captains tried to give him. Mafia Queen. He laughed once when he heard it, sharp and humorless, then told them if anyone called him that again, he would make sure Naira assigned them paperwork until they begged for exile. After that, they called him Director Rowan. Vaxen had smiled at that, not openly, but enough for Aster to catch it. Months passed, and the city changed in pieces. Trafficking routes collapsed. Clinics disappeared overnight. Founders who once spoke with untouchable confidence started hiding behind lawyers, bodyguards, and sealed gates. Magnus Varelli tried to trade information for comfort, but Vaxen gave him no comfort, and Aster gave him no fear. The old alpha who had once watched Omegas suffer behind glass now sat behind glass himself, waiting for trial before a council of families he could no longer control. The greatest change happened during a rescue outside the East District, where Aster found a young Omega boy locked in a storage room behind a fake wellness clinic. The boy was shaking too hard to walk and kept apologizing as if survival were a crime. Aster crouched in front of him, kept both hands visible, and said the words no one had said to him when he was 16. You are not property. You are not ruined. You are coming with us. The boy broke down. Aster did not. He held him until the rescue team arrived, and when he walked out carrying the boy's medical file under one arm, he saw Vaxen waiting by the car. The alpha did not rush him. He did not ask whether Aster was fine. They both knew fine was too small a word for what that moment meant. That night, Aster stood on the penthouse balcony overlooking the city that had nearly swallowed him. Vaxen came to stand beside him, close enough for warmth, not close enough to cage. The mark at Aster's neck had healed into a dark crescent beneath the skin, sensitive when Vaxen's scent was near, steady when the world felt too loud. You gave up everything for this, Aster said. Vaxen looked at the lights below. Not everything. Your empire. I gave up a machine built by men like Magnus and Dorian. That was not an empire worth keeping. Aster turned toward him. And if rebuilding this costs more than you think? Vaxen finally looked at him, and the honesty in his face was harder to bear than any promise. Then it costs more. Aster searched his expression for hesitation and found none. The bond between them warmed, not demanding, not pulling, simply present. For months, Vaxen had touched him only when invited, had waited through nightmares, had stood near every door without blocking it, had made room for Aster to become someone other than a survivor. That patience had become its own kind of love. Aster stepped closer. Vaxen went still, giving him the choice even now. I am going to be difficult, Aster said. I know. I will still wake up angry. I know. I may never be soft in the way people expect Omegas to be. Vaxen's mouth curved slightly. Good. Aster looked at him, and something inside his chest loosened. He reached up, gripped the front of Vaxen's shirt, and kissed him because he wanted to, because no serum forced it, because no bond demanded it, and because choosing him felt nothing like surrender. Vaxen kissed him back slowly, carefully at first, until Aster pulled him closer and made it clear he was not breakable. When they parted, Vaxen lowered his forehead to Aster's and breathed like a man finally allowed to stop fighting for one moment. Then he bent and pressed a kiss to the mark on Aster's neck. Not as ownership, as a vow. Aster closed his eyes and let himself feel it. Far below, another Aegis team left for a new rescue, following a lead Cass had pulled from the recovered files. The work was not finished. It might never be finished. But Aster was no longer running from the dark. He was walking back into it with people behind him, a purpose in front of him, and an alpha beside him who had learned that love was not possession. It was protection. It was patience. It was choosing someone again and again, even after the fire was gone. And when Vaxen took his hand, Aster did not pull away. And that is where Vaxen and Aster's story ends. Not with the scars erased, but with their meaning changed forever. Aster was no longer a hunted Omega, and Vaxen was no longer a king of fear. Together, they turned pain into purpose and love into protection. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you in the next story.